Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko auto da se te manga, ko beberibi me capibaribi te awa, ko Pindorama Brasil, ko tu whenua, ko Kaete me Portugal o ko Kainga Tuturu, ko New Zealand te waka, ko te Kohinga Marama tōku marae, no te whanau o Milfont, ko Taciano hau, ko Erika, tōku ahau wahini, e rua o ko Tiro, ko Mila me Elise. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks, Brian, for the introduction. Also, thanks, Eddie, Rizzi, Alda Rezendi for the music. I'm going to divide my talk into 3 areas. You heard a little bit about my whakapapa already, but I'll go a bit deeper. Not only about my family whakapapa, but my intellectual and university whakapapa. And then I'll move to talk about my scholarly contributions, just to give you a little bit of flavor on the type of work I do. And then I'll conclude by posing some directions that I'm interested in currently pursuing. And underpinning all these 3 areas is this idea of a privileged underdog. This is how I feel. This is how people make me feel, being in between cultures and having to succeed in a different reality and a different cultural background. And this makes my work much more engaged in activism, in the sense of trying to lift barriers for others to succeed in their underpinnings, in their dreams as well. So I start with my whakapapa. So it's an amazing opportunity, and I'm also privileged to be able to present a little bit about my journey. I know that there are many amazing professionals that never have this opportunity to share in the public sphere his or her journey. So I'm really privileged to be able to do so. So I'll be talking a little bit about my identity and my identity formation. So just to bring a little bit of psychology into it, you can say that I will be talking a little bit about narrative psychology. But narrative psychology is never about, Wikipedia. So a person's life story is not a Wikipedia biography of the facts and events of a life, but rather the way a person integrates those facts and events internally to create his or her identity. And it will become clear that even the title of my presentation brings my identity to the fore, and this is what I want to share with you briefly. So I'm from Brazil, as some of you already know, and I'm from Olinda. Olinda is one of the oldest cities of Brazil, and the name means "oh, beautiful," or Linda. And it's from the state of Pernambuco. It's a really culturally diverse state, and there are many, including a famous singer from my state, Lenini, who said we are so culturally diverse that even in the name Pernambuco, there is no single letter that repeats itself. So it's really diverse. And the name comes from an indigenous language, Tupi-Guarani, and it means buraco no mar, or a hole in the sea, because there are many rivers, and I mentioned 2 rivers in my Pepeha, Beberibi, and Capibaribi. So this is my whakapapa, my family. My mother's family is Lemos, and they came from, both families from Pernambuco, but one from Glória do Goitá. Most European immigrants that came to Brazil. Again, about privilege in Brazil, unfortunately, we didn't keep a lot of good records of our heritage for, power, religious, and inheritance reasons. They burned the papers from the ships arriving to Brazil. So unfortunately, we can't really connect our whakapapa. But we know that Lemos is a quite famous pronounced surname from Portugal. My father's family is much more indigenous looking, but again, we don't have the records. But we believe, and this is why I use my Pepeha, Kaete, as the largest indigenous groups from Pernambuco at that time. My grandparents had 14 kids. My father was the oldest. My granddad was killed when my father was 18, and he had to look after all his siblings. And that happened because family dispute in the countryside of the state in Pernambuco, in this city, Exu. And my original family name was Saraiva, but we had to get rid of it because it was too dangerous to carry that surname because people could kill us. So after my granddad was killed, the family moved to Glória do Goitá. It's where my parents met. They are there on the wedding day. My mom is shaking her head. So we had a typical lower class, upbringing. My sister is now doing a master's in language, but they never progress after a degree to do a master's before. I was the first in my family, but they always like to study. So my father studied education and then law. My mom studied education and then international relations. My brother studied first speech therapy and then law. And my sister did accounting, then education, and now, as I said, is doing a master's in education. This is some picture of myself growing up. Because we talked about it recently, I was really religious growing up, Catholic, and you can see a picture up there. But I like to have fun. You can see a picture of me with a cast in my arm. I broke my arm a few times. That one was getting mango from a mango tree. And my family, as you can imagine, in my father's side, 14 uncles and aunties, and the other side, 6. I have a really extended family. And I forgot to mention and highlight that my father and my mother were the oldest in the families. A lot of responsibilities they had to look after them. But quite adventurous upbringing, which brings me to the idea of maloqueiro that you saw in the title, Maloqueiro nas Olindas. And it was interesting because Brazilians were asking me, what does it mean? Because in my hometown, it means this. But it's quite unique to upbringings in our lives in Olinda. So I asked some friends from that reality to share what it means to you. So a guy who was born or raised in the slopes of Olinda, a wise person whose knowledge originates from everyday experience, marked by uncertainty, boredom, and tubas, frevo music, an out-of-season carnival lover, a thief of hearts, an everyday athlete, young people on the margins of society who group together to create visibility for their existence. Or, too hard to explain, only being one to know, a good friend, Luna, who is there. It's amazing to have an old childhood friend. We know each other for over 30 years, and he now migrated to New Zealand about 6 years ago. So it's hard to explain. Perhaps pictures would tell a little bit. But it's someone who, is trying to figure out what he or she wants to do, but it's connected to the carnival culture of Brazil and Olinda, and the frevo. And there's a picture of a good friend of mine, Diogo Duarte, and you can see me there in my happy place, surrounded by frevo music and lots of people. Which brings me to my family, my wonderful family. And it gives me a lot of joy to know that a lot of my friends from Olinda recognize Erica, Mila, and Alice as maloqueiras as well. And they call them maloqueiras das Olinda. What about my intellectual whakapapa? There are two figures that are quite important to me that made me decide to study psychology at the first place. One is the poet Fernando Pessoa from Portugal, and in particular, the writings he did under this pseudonym Alberto Caeiro, the Brazilian writer Clarice Lispector, and the rock singer and composer Raul Seixas. And Alda and Ed sang some of Raul's songs earlier today. So completely different art forms, but they all brought this idea of existential questioning. And that was really inspiring to me to figure out, to try to understand why we are here and what I want to pursue in my career. And I knew that I want to do psychology. It was really interesting because I went and did a vocational test. And the psychologist at that time said, well, you should do law or arts. And so, no, I really want to do psychology. So, yeah, I don't think it will fit you, but good luck. But I knew I want to do that. We didn't have anyone in my family, so I couldn't go and ask about it and talk about it. But those existential questions were really strong and made me decide to study psychology. It's interesting that still today, childhood friends still call me Da Lua or from the moon, unusual thinker and non-conformist. This is the side of me that's still quite prevalent. University Facapapa, I did my undergraduates at the university, the Catholic University of Pernambuco. I did community and clinical work grounded in Gestalt therapy, and then I did an internship in industrial and organizational psychology in a big multinational Alcoa. Interestingly enough, I decided to do a master's degree. I failed the English exam in the University of the capital of Brazil, Brasilia. It's so you understand the level of English I had when I started my journey here in New Zealand. So I decided to go closer to my hometown, and I did my master's in another public university. And my first main mentor was Professor Gouveia. And I focused on human values and intimate relationships. And then he was telling us, you should try and do your PhD in an English-speaking country so you can publish in English. Yeah, the language of science is English. So I started thinking what to do, looking at options. I was planning to go, being a surfer, I was thinking to go to California to study there. But the colleague I contacted there, unfortunately, he said they didn't have a PhD program. But huge coincidence, he said, but I received this email from a professor from New Zealand. You should consider New Zealand. And I said, well, I didn't know anything about New Zealand. But the focus was to save my scholarship money from my master's to convert into dollar. And my parents were able to help me. And I came to New Zealand in 2001. Some pictures from that time. My first ever English book I read was Harry Potter. My first ever New Zealand CD was Chefu. And I had the opportunity through capoeira, a Brazilian martial arts. I was the only Brazilian in that group at that time with a master who came from California. And we stayed in the Marae, which is close to Rotorua. And it's amazing that I'm now based here in Bay of Plenty, close to that Marae. So my first experience there. But I already had in mind that I want to come back and do my PhD. So before coming here, I contacted a professor at the University of Auckland, and I was a honorary research assistant, and I was helping him to enter data and figure out how I could come back with a scholarship. So I would go to an English school from 9 to 2 and then work 3 hours with him, for him. I went back in this gap year, 2002. I passed an exam, a really competitive exam to work in a federal university in Brazil. But I quit this job for life position when I received a scholarship from the University of Auckland. The university offered a scholarship that only paid the fees, so I had to work to survive, and it was quite tough. But I did my PhD with another amazing mentor I had, John Dacht, and the focus was cross-cultural research on environmental attitudes, and my visa only allowed me to work 15 hours per week. So the job I had, the first one was working at the university library, from 6 to 9 every morning. I didn't have a lot of money, so I had to drink a lot of the milk made available at the School of Psychology. And then I started getting tutoring jobs. Remember, my English was not really sharp at that time. But I work really hard, and I get the first year here, I submit my first English publication. And it's amazing. That was the first study of my PhD, and still really relevant. It's quite cited internationally. It's quite technical. My English has improved, but I made it. Yeah, my dream of coming here and publishing English was fulfilled, and I wanted more. So I got positions here. It was really interesting when I told my parents, when I got the offer to stay. And they said, well, that wasn't the deal. The deal was for you to go study and come back. But I decided to stay. So first I worked as a research fellow in an amazing project, the Youth 2000 project with doctors and nurses. And then I got a formal, lecturing position at Victoria University of Wellington. I stayed there for 12 years. And then, for family reasons and professional reasons, we moved here in 2020 for the University of Waikato here in Tauranga Moana. Okay. So this is a little bit of my whakapapa. What about my scholarly contributions? First, I need to acknowledge that science is as a team sport. I publish with a lot of collaborators. So I need to thank my mentors, formal and informal mentors, but also my collaborators and students. And also the funding. Over the years, I have secured myself and with my colleagues, many fundings from Brazil, from New Zealand, and also internationally. Some of you have seen this illusion before, yeah? It's the horizontal vertical illusion. It looks like the vertical line is bigger than the horizontal line, but in fact they are the same. And I think this illustrates my academic pursuit. So I can say that, my deep interest is environmental psychology, but I would find too boring to just study that. Psychology is such a beautiful discipline that I'm interested in other things. So I have this horizontal approach to my work as well. So it's a T for Taciano, but also my focus of my work. But I could say that perhaps it's an illusion, because if you look at my publications, I go to many domains. So just to provide some examples, I'm interested in how to measure psychological phenomenon. And it has varied from looking at depression, life satisfaction, and how to measure psychological phenomenon across cultural groups. What's the best way to do so? And I'm also really interested to understand our perception of time perspective, and how it impacts our daily life. And I'll talk briefly about this soon. I'm quite also interested in understanding the role of context in influence psychological phenomena. Yeah. So, for example, recently we published with colleagues, health geographers from Christchurch, looking at how features of a neighborhood in New Zealand impact people's health and well-being. Yeah. And I've done that within schools context as well, how schools characteristics can impact kids' health and well-being. And so on. So it's a really area that I'm interested. I'm also really interested in cultural similarities and variability. Are the psychological phenomena that we experience, emotions, beliefs, values, are similar across cultural groups? Are they different? Why do they differ? Yeah. So some examples, I have been studying self-identity across cultural groups. We published this paper on relational mobility, how easy or difficult it is to make social connections and friendships across cultures. Contextualism in itself, how people perceive the importance of context in their lives. And more recently, we published a paper looking at beliefs in luck and precognition across cultural groups. Recently, we experienced COVID. I joined a few projects, and with colleagues from Auckland University. One is Danny, who is there. we published a paper looking at the effect of the first lockdown in people's health and well-being. With a larger cultural group of researchers, we look at stress and worry. And more recently, together with Danny again and Chris Sibley, we look at the impact of the COVID experience on people's environmental attitudes. And because now I'm talking about environmental attitudes, I'll go a little bit deeper on my vertical interest. Understanding environmental problems is quite broad. Within psychology is also broad, but I use a theoretical frame that I really like and I want to share with you. It's the idea of psychological distance. So life situations are often removed in time or space. They pertain to others' experiences, are hypothetical rather than real. When considering, planning, and evaluating life situations, we mentally transverse psychological distance. And this is really key and important for us because without this capacity, we'll be trapped on the here and now. So we need to imagine other realities. The literature has identified 4 main dimensions of psychological distance. So imagine that you are there in the middle. These are the 4 dimensions: spatial, social, temporal, and hypothetical. So things that are close to you are psychologically near. Things that are far apart are psychologically distant. So for each of these, we can put, for example, in the social dimension, things that are related to myself. It's about me, and so it's psychologically near, close. And when I start thinking about others, I automatically increase distance because I need to imagine how others are feeling, thinking, and so on. So it has cognitive implications. Things that are close to us, we tend to experience them. They tend to be concrete. And we construe them mentally in a low-level construe. In contrast, things that are far away from us, they are abstract, general, and we use a high-level construal, a mental representation of those things. Yeah? So I'll show how this can be important to understand environmental problems. But first, I want to illustrate how these dimensions are related. Is there anything wrong with this figure there? Wrong way around, yeah? But there is no right way. But we unconsciously link dimensions of psychological distance. And you said, is the other way around because there is a mismatch between 2 dimensions of psychological distance. The social dimension, us and them, and the spatial dimension, the here and there. Yeah? So cognitively, we want them to match. We want the us close to us and the them far away from us. Yeah? So they are related. Although we don't know why, yeah, but we react when there is a mismatch. So for many, many years, I've been arguing that psychological distancing is important for understanding and addressing environmental problems. I argue that the extent to which individuals perceive environmental problems as a certain issue, so the hypothetical dimension, with effects in the here and now, the spatial and temporal, and to people like them, the social dimension. Yeah? So over the years, I have been exploring these dimensions in relation to environmental issues. Today, I'll focus on the spatial dimension. There is a key find in the literature related to this spatial dimension, is that environmental problems tend to be perceived as more worrying when they take place at greater distances. So it's worse there than here. It was first observed in the 70s, as far as we know, but has been documented in other publications. And folks have used different labels for it: environmental hyperopia, worse there than here, better here than there. And the label I prefer to use is simpler spatial bias. In my publications, the first time I observed this phenomenon was in a study in my PhD thesis. So I asked participants to rate the seriousness of 6 environmental problems in their community and also worldwide. and you can read the 6 environmental problems there. And I found that environmental problems are perceived as more serious globally than locally. The first major cross-cultural study was led by Professor Robert Gifford from Canada in 2009. And across 18 countries, they observed that people tend to believe environmental problems are worse there than here. And in that study, they used 3 levels: local level, national level, and global level. And across most of these samples, 18 samples, environmental problems are perceived worse there than here. But there was a gap. They didn't include New Zealand sample. So I did a study. We collect 2 New Zealand samples. And we also found and confirmed this bias, that New Zealanders tend to perceive environmental problems as worse there than here. And then in my first sabbatical, I want to explore that a little bit further. And I worked with Professor Wesley Schultz from California. And in this publication, we had 30 samples from 26 countries, so a much larger sample than the 18 and 19 plus New Zealand study. And we also want to see if, because one might argue that, well, this is not a bias. People know the context, and they know that environmental problems are worse there than here. So you want to check if it was a factual knowledge that people had or a bias. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but we use this environmental sustainability index. Is a objective index developed by experts in Yale University. There are 9 indicators. So it's not based on people's judgment, but it's an objective measure of environmental sustainability. And we plot this real objective measure with the people's perception of the reality in the locality. And if there wasn't a bias, these 2 lines would match. But you can see that the subjective line is above the objective line, illustrating that people's perception of environmental problems does not match the true reality. Yeah? But the main point here is that we observed across these samples, apart from Romania was the outlier there, that people tend to believe environmental problems are worse there than here. So recently I went a bit further and say, what about if I study a single country and I collect data across all states in Brazil? These numbers, there are the sample size in each state. And I did with a colleague, Rob from Wellington, who now lives in Japan. And we found exactly the same. Brazilians tend to believe environmental problems are worse nationally than locally. And we argue that it's a bias because your state belongs to the country. Yeah? Your country belongs globally. So if everyone believes that's worse there than here, it's a bias. Yeah? So we've been arguing that spatial bias is perhaps a plausible psychological universal. So it's cognitively available to people in many cultural groups, and we have shown across nations, but also within a continent-sized country in Brazil. So it seems that perhaps it's a judgment process similar to self-other comparisons. It's a quite well-established finding in psychology, the self-serving bias, or we call above average or comparative optimism effects. People tend to believe they are better than average in many things. They are better looking than average. They are smarter than average, and so on. Or negatively, they are less likely to have a car accident, less likely to have a heart attack, and so on. But if everyone believes that, there is no average. Yes? Because everyone believes they are better looking, smart, and so on. So we tend to believe that it's the same process operating there. So we argue that functionally it may serve as an awareness buffer of the severity of environmental problems in one's local area. So a place-serving bias. It's better to believe that the problem is there, not here. Yeah? But as you can guess, this is consequential because it can reduce people's motivation to act. If I believe environmental problems are worse there, not here, why should I care? Let them care, yeah? Because I'm distancing myself from the issue. So it comes the idea of psychological distance again. And I'll illustrate that with a study we did. This, as you know, the map of New Zealand, these little black dots are participants, and we highlight the largest locations of participants, Auckland and Christchurch. And we want to see if people's proximity to the shoreline impacts their beliefs. And we use GIS as a technology to map where people live and calculate the closest point to the shoreline. And we want to replicate in an island nation in New Zealand because studies have shown this effect in the US. But in the US, for you to live in the coastline, it's quite hard because it's a really large country. So we want to try to test if there is this effect of proximity to the coast in people's environmental orientations in an island nation country. And we found in this national probability sample, using data from the New Zealand Attitudes and Values study, that people living closer to the shoreline express greater belief that climate change is real and greater support for government regulation of carbon emissions. So we argue that physical place plays a role in the psychological acceptance of environmental problems, perhaps because the effects become more concrete and local, so it reduces psychological distance or spatial bias. And I believe this is what we experienced after the cyclone we had in New Zealand. These affected areas, people live in those regions are much more aware of the consequence of the cyclone, and they might be much more willing to support action than people who live in other regions of the country. The problem for us is to translate these across locality because we know environmental problems are affecting everyone. Yeah? Recently was there, but most likely it's going to happen here to us. Okay, so current and future directions. This, I mentioned the privileged underdog identity that I carry. And this is another quote that carries my work. Washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. There is no political neutrality. Yeah? Paulo Freire is from my hometown, from Pernambuco. And it's really special to be talking about him today here, because in Brazil, if you talk about his name, you are communist. It's so unbelievably stupid and crazy that I had to mention this here. So amazing intellectual who wants to help others, but helping others is not positively seen nowadays. His work influences, although I'm not working in education broadly or teaching teachers, or future teachers, his teaching is really impactful in my career in the way I work and try to help others and collaborate with others. But if you don't want to think about Paulo Freire, look at our Education Act. It says that we have academic freedom, not only academics, but students. And we should use academic freedom. And that universities accept a role as critic and conscience of society. And I think it is really beautiful and powerful here in New Zealand in our context, is to use the privilege we have at universities to further knowledge, but also to criticize what's happening, yeah, within the law, of course. So in my work, I've been looking at the politics and sociology of science as well. So for example, the Matthew effect, that powerful academics tend to bring more money, more resource to him or her. And now as a professor, I'm questioning my position. No, I don't want to be this catalyst of bringing more power to me, but allocating, distributing power to others. which leads to this idea of hierarchical power relations. So being a non-English speaker, many times I submit a manuscript and say, the English is not really good. And I had to really work really hard. And I understand it's a fair criticism. But it's from a hierarchical perspective, not from an educational perspective. Coming from a non-top university, people just reject your work. Coming from New Zealand, many colleagues have experienced that from New Zealand. Who cares? Data from New Zealand. Who cares, knowing what New Zealanders felt during the pandemic? It's a small country. But if you have data from the US, there you go. Many, many times. So we've been challenging these really strongly. And the power in the language, I'm American because America is the continent. It's not a country. Yeah? So these languages are really powerful. It carry power relations that I'm constantly challenging. And also these shifting goalposts. I have experienced this so much in my career. I've seen people being introduced and say, wow, look at this person. He or she published in this journal. And I say, wow, okay, so I need to publish in that journal. And I publish in that journal. I say, yeah, it's okay. Or that person has this number of citations. So, oh, I need to have citations. And I get the citations. Yeah, not okay. Why? Why is that? So I question this constantly. Corruption and scientific dishonesty. And there are many levels here. The abuse of entrusted power for private gain, actually corruption within university and within science, intentionally not citing studies because I'm from Brazil, from India, who cares? Not acknowledging original source or ideas. This person had this original idea. I can collaborate with him or her or bring her, or acknowledge the idea in my work. So I'm trying to focus on how to replicate, beyond challenging these things, how to replicate studies and focus on open science. It's a broad movement within psychology and science more broadly. But I've been published quite effectively on corruption. Look at jeitinho brasileiro, or Brazilian jeitinho, is our way of navigating bureaucracy and hierarchy in Brazilian, similar to pulling strings that you have, in English context, but it's quite more prevalent in Brazil. And looking at corruption more explicitly, yeah? And fascinates me how the word corruption is hardly used in the New Zealand context. But again, it's a power relation. It's easier to say, well, corruption happens there. Yeah? Not here. But pretty much every day when I read the news, things I say, well, in Brazil, we label this corruption, but here you just avoid the word. Yeah? But it's here. It's here. Yeah? And more recently, I'm trying to understand the impact of human rights. I believe the Declaration of Human Rights are really powerful historically and socially, and we are taking for granted. And I think we need to recognize how important that document is, how powerful it is. So I'm looking at human rights broadly, but also indigenous rights with Maori colleagues. And finally, recently, I joined the Ministry for the Environment. I'm on a 2-year fixed-term position on a behavior insights lead within a small but really effective team, system change and capability. It's a great opportunity to apply psychological knowledge to policy design and implementation that hopefully will have decades-long implications to our country. That's me. Thank you very much.